Everybody, we're going to get started in a minute. I am recording this, so I just wanted to let everybody know because we're going to use this as a learning tool for other groups of people. There are people that have asked to watch it that couldn't make it today. So thank you, Peter, so much for taking the time to share this story with us. And there's a number of you that have helped today. We're delighted that we have 5 congregations participating today with their religious schools. We have B'nai Shalom Only, Bethel Hebrew Congregation, Eitz Chaim, Shar Shalom Congregation, as well as Agudas Achim. So it's great to have you all with us. And we're going to have a nice, so basically we're going to do a couple introductions, and then Peter's going to share his story, and then there will be Dana Foster is going to facilitate a Q&A. So we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A, and students, you guys have the first opportunity to ask Q&A before we open up to general community that's joining us today. So thank you all. We're really looking forward to this. Ari, I'm going to pass it off to you to give the JCRC intro, and then Laura is going to introduce Peter, and then Peter's going to speak. So that's our game plan here. Thanks, Peter. Or thanks, Ari. Sorry.
All right, great. So hi, as Sarah mentioned, my name is Ari, and I'm a leader in the JCRC student-to-student program and a member of the Agudas Achim congregation. On behalf of the JCRC, I want to thank all of you for joining us for our door-to-door conversation with Péter Gorog, a Holocaust survivor. For decades, the JCRC of Greater Washington has had the great honor and responsibility of organizing and hosting community-wide Yom HaShoah commemorations and other Holocaust education programming. And each year we connect local Holocaust survivors to thousands of students and adults throughout the DMV to hear their living testimonies of their experiences during the Holocaust. After hearing our speaker today, I hope you'd consider joining me in the JCRC student-to-student program when you're a junior or senior in high school. For me personally, it's given me the amazing opportunity to help educate high schoolers throughout the DC area about Judaism and my Jewish experience. And as a part of our core mission of fighting anti-Semitism, has helped me to do my part in living up to the Jewish community's mantra of never again. The work we do is incredibly fulfilling, and you'll be able to make many new friends. And so I'd strongly urge you to join when you have the opportunity. And finally, thank you to all of our survivors and their descendants for taking the time to speak with us. And thank you to all of you who are joining us to hear their testimonies and affirm that we will carry on their legacies. Thank you to Dana Foster, the education director at B'nai Shalom in Olney, for facilitating today. And of course, a huge thank you to Peter for taking the time to speak with us. And with that, I'll hand it over to Laura.
Thank you, Ari. Can you hear me? Just raise a hand, let me know. Thank you so much. Good morning, Boker Tov. I am honored to introduce Péter Gorog. He's our speaker today. And Mr. Gorog, if I mispronounce anything, please just jump in and correct me. So Péter Gorog was born Péter Grünwald in Budapest, the capital of Hungary, on March 10th, 1941. His father, Árpád, worked as an office manager, and his mother, Olga, was a hat maker. In August 1940, Árpád was drafted into a forced labor battalion, along with thousands of other Jewish men, by the Hungarian government. He had to leave Olga, who was pregnant with Péter. Árpád was home for Péter's birth in March 1941 and visited him a few times after that. In 1943, Árpád was reported missing. Olga was told that Árpád was left behind when Hungarian forces were retreating from advancing Soviet troops, and he presumably froze to death. Olga supported the family through income from her hat making until she was forced out of the apartment that also served as her shop. German forces invaded Hungary in March 1944, and the Hungarian government ordered the Jews of Budapest to move into houses marked with a yellow Star of David. Olga and Peter found refuge with a distant family member who had converted from Judaism to Christianity in one of these yellow star houses. In October 1944, Olga was arrested and taken to the Mosonyi Street jail. She was released after 3 weeks, and the family moved into an internationally protected apartment. Then in late 1944, Olga and Peter moved to the Budapest ghetto, where they lived near Peter's grandparents, 2 aunts, and a cousin. They spent most of their time in the basement during the frequent Allied air raids. After weeks of fierce fighting, the Budapest ghetto was liberated by the Soviet army in January 1945. However, tragically, Peter's grandparents died of illnesses exacerbated by malnutrition and lack of medical care a few months after liberation. Peter grew up after the war in communist Hungary and changed his family name in 1962 from Grünwald to Gorog for fear of anti-Semitic discrimination. He earned a Master of Science degree in electrical engineering. He defected to the United States in 1940, where he worked on projects for NASA until he retired in 2014. He and his wife were blessed with 5 beautiful daughters. Peter is a volunteer at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, and we are honored to hear from you today, Mr. Gorog.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Ari. Thank you, Laura. You all pronounced my name correctly, as close as you could. Last week, we commemorated Shoah. I lit candle in the memory of the 6 million. I lit a candle in the memory of my father and my family. And I lit a candle for the 1.5 million children who perished during the Holocaust. It's their story and my story and my family story, what you're gonna hear today. Both of my parents were born in 1907, and a little bit of geography because I think it matters. If we can see the next slide. Hopefully everybody knows where Hungary is today in Eastern Europe. Hungarians like to regard themselves as Central European. The next map shows current Hungary and the Hungary which was part of the
Peter, hold on 1 second. I'm sorry. It took me a minute on the slides. I'm a little behind. So let me get up to this. I didn't show this map yet. Here's the map.
Can we go to the next one?
Yes.
Thank you. So the reason I'm showing this map is because a little bit of history also. Jews lived in Hungary for 2 millennia. Actually, they lived there before the Hungarians came in approximately at 1000 Common Era. And up until 1914, the end of the First World War, Hungarian Jews had a so-called golden era of Judaism in Hungary. In 1867, they were emancipated. They became full-fledged Hungarian citizens. They got all kind of aristocratic titles, and they were in leadership in many companies. They had seats in the Hungarian parliament. First World War changed the whole situation. Hungary was on the losing side, as unfortunately during most of her history. Anyway, after the war, there was a treaty, the so-called Versailles Treaty, and attached to it the so-called Trianon Treaty, which took about 1/3 of the Hungarian territory away from Hungary, and they were given to the surrounding countries. Also, about 2 million Hungarians, about 30% of the population, became citizens of Slovakia, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Yugoslavia, and the other countries. So after the war, there was a tremendous resentment, just like in Nazi Germany, which led to ultimately Hungary's participation in the Second World War and Hungary's connection to Nazi Germany. If we can go to the next slide, you will see my parents in 1937 on their wedding day. they met in 1930. My mom came from a very Orthodox family. My great-grandfather was a rabbi, actually, in a small town which is part of Slovakia today, called Prešov. And very observant family. On my father's side, he came from a family of what conservative Judaism was at that time in Hungary. They met in 1930, got married 1937. They had a relatively normal and good middle-class life. My mother was a hat maker. Hat was very fashionable in the 20s and 30s, and she made a very good living. My father was an office manager in a publishing company. He was well respected, and their income provided them a relatively good middle-class life. They loved outdoors, and you will see on the next slide that they loved going out camping and kayaking, and the winters they went skiing, and they had lots of friends, great social life, and everything was okay until 1940, when my mom got pregnant with me. That was not the problem. The problem was that a couple of months later, my father was called in the so-called forced labor battalion, which was a very specific arrangement in Europe. The Holocaust history is a little bit, actually much different from the rest of Europe, because Hungary was not occupied by Nazi Germany until 1944. Nevertheless, anti-Semitism was alive and well, and the anti-Semitic laws were as bad, as restrictive as they were in Nazi Germany, the infamous Nuremberg laws. So Germany didn't have a reason to occupy Hungary because everything went along their own line. As I said, my mom was 3 months pregnant when my father was conscripted into the Hungarian forced labor battalions. Hungarian government did not trust Hungarian Jews. Hungary entered in the war in 1939 along Nazi Germany, and their purpose was to reclaim those territories they lost after World War I, and they reoccupied all of those territories along with the Germans. And Hungarian army went into those countries, and they needed people. They didn't have enough people in the regular army, so they conscripted Jews, Jewish males between age 18 and 50 or 55, and they served not in the regular military unit, but in the first labor battalions. And they did all the dirty and the hard work for the army. They didn't have rifle pistols because they weren't trusted. And the picture you can see, the only picture I have with my mom and dad. I think there is another picture just with my father, which I cherish very much. If it's not on this slide. Anyway, if we can go back a couple of pictures or slides.
Okay, sorry, I'm not doing too well here on the
If
slides.
we cannot.
With you and your parents?
Yes. And yeah, obviously that slide somehow slid out. I don't know. Anyway, if we can go to the next slide, you can see my father in the forced labor battalion with his comrades. Those people who were conscripted early on, the Hungarian army had enough uniforms, so they actually had Hungarian military uniform. People who were conscripted later in the war, when there was a shortage of uniforms, they wore their civilian clothes, and during the winter, that caused plenty of troubles, tourists for them. My father served on and off 3 months in the forced labor battalion. He was released for 1 month and he had to go back again. What happened to him at the forced labor battalion, I don't know. I don't know because my mother didn't tell me. I don't know because I was a toddler when he was taken away. But I do know how he felt while he was serving in those forced labor battalions, because he sent postcards regularly. Those postcards were censored, and he couldn't tell where he was and what he was doing. We do know what people in the forced labor battalion were doing, because some of them, very few of them, unfortunately survived. And later on, they told their story, they wrote their memoirs. The postcard you see in the picture is, or the screen, was the last postcard he sent in December 1942. And I would like to read just a little bit of excerpt from it, because I think it's important to know how people who were victims of the Holocaust, how they felt about their situation, what their dreams, what their hopes were. So here is what he wrote. I got all of your cards. This was addressed to my mom. They caused me great pleasure, and I ask you to write more often, because reading them, every line is a very special day, special holiday for me. Your cards are full of longing for me, and can you imagine how much I long for you and for a little warm home? But for the time being, we have to be very patient. We have to wait steadfastly and trust in the good Lord. I cannot emphasize enough how much you have to take care of your health. And he ended, million kisses to you and my dear little Peter from Árpád, who loves you a lot. Everything I am telling you today based upon about 20-25 of the postcards my father sent to my mom, also based on my mom's diary, which she started a little bit later on, and she didn't mean or didn't design it to be a diary. My mom, in early 1943, about a month after my father sent the last postcard, got a notification from the Hungarian Red Cross that my father disappeared during war activities. Now, this was a generic card. Everybody who died or disappeared, the relatives got the same card. Disappeared for those who were serving in the forced labor battalion could have meant anything. We know that many of them died because of starvation. They didn't have enough food. Many of them died because of the brutality of the Hungarian officers. Many of them died because they were used to defuse the mines the retreating Soviet Red Army left behind to slow down the Germans' progress. And people in the forced labor battalion were used to defuse those, and they weren't experts. They were teachers and lawyers and doctors or administrative work they did. The way they diffused the mines, that the officers of the army forced them to walk through the minefield. And as they walked through, the mines exploded, and so did the people. So we don't know exactly what happened to my mom. The only hint we have that my mom tracked down one of the person, and probably one of the only person who survived or were not captured by the Russians. And when he came home, he told my mom that he saw a diary written by another person in the battalion who didn't survive. And he saw a reference to my father that he was left behind. Now, left behind in January 1943 in Ukraine, that he was left behind in snow, which was knee-high or maybe higher. He might have been starving. There was no adequate clothes for that harsh winter. So most likely he was frozen to death. That's all I know about him. And unfortunately, he never came back. Meantime, my mom started her diary in probably March, April 1943. And I know some of the stories and her feelings from this diary. And I would like to read a paragraph from this diary, which you should see in your screen as soon as Sarah is able to bring it back. But meantime, here are her words. One day, she was addressing this one to my father because here is the diary. Because she hoped that one day my father would come back, and she wanted to have all the details written down so she can tell everything about what happened to us, including my first silly pronunciations of those very hard to pronounce Hungarian words, and what I like to eat, and how much I hated water or being bathed during the night. Anyway, going back to the diary. One day you will show up our door without any advance notice, and then I would not switch with anyone in the world, and I'll be the happiest person ever live. This is the only thing that keeps me going, keeps my spirit high, and gives me strength to endure what lies ahead, and how wonderful it will be to be together again. I cannot imagine any greater happiness. I would have gone crazy if I couldn't find consolation in our little Peter. I hope and I believe that the good Lord will hear our prayers, and he will help us to see each other again and soon. Unfortunately, it did not happen. After my mom got that certification, the notice that my father disappeared, she also got an official death certificate from the Hungarian government, which later on became very important because it saved our life. We lived a relatively normal life while my father was away. My mom wrote in her diary that she went to coffee house to meet with her friends and exchange news about husbands. As far as I know, all of her friends were Jewish. They were part of a hiking club, most of them, and although it wasn't denominational, but somehow it just happened that most of the members were Jewish. Normal life in Budapest in 1943 meant shortages of practically everything. Food was, or groceries were rationed, there were curfews, but we were still alive. We were still alive and relatively safe until March 1944, when Germany was already losing the war, and Germany already experienced some of its allies to switch sides. Romania and Italy was not allied. They were not allied with Nazi Germany anymore, and they were afraid that Hungary would do the same. So in March 1944, the Nazi army, the Wehrmacht, came into Budapest, and everything changed. Everything changed. The rounding up of the Hungarian Jews started. That was the right slide, Sarah, if you could go forward. The rounding up of the Hungarian Jews started first in the countryside, although this picture was taken in Budapest, but first between April and July, in a matter of 3 months, more than 400,000, approximately 440,000 Hungarian Jews were deported from Hungary to the Nazi-occupied Poland, where the Nazis, the German Nazis, set up the concentration camps and the killing camps, and Hungarian Jews were sent mostly to Auschwitz, but some of them ended up in Treblinka and Sobibor and the other camps. While the Germans and the Hungarians were complicit in the deportation of the Jews and the death of the Jews by the Germans, we Jews in Budapest were in a relatively safe situation because by this time the Allied relentlessly bombed the railways, and there were shortages of cattle cars which were used to ship Hungarian Jews to Auschwitz. And so because they started the deportation in the countryside, we were relatively safe until the summer of 1944, when the rounding up of the Budapest Jews started also. I put this slide in the presentation because it's extremely important for everybody to know who were doing the arrest, who were doing the rounding up the Jews. You can see the Jews in the middle of the picture. We already had to wear the yellow Star of David. And you can see the people in the background. You can see the bystanders who were physically bystanders standing by the road, and looking at their neighbors, their colleagues, their fellow Hungarian citizens, and they were smiling. I put a red arrow to one of the person in the background. I don't know if you can see it, but he's smiling and some of the people around him. And so all the atrocities by the Nazis couldn't have happened without those people who were bystanders, who didn't do anything to save their fellow citizens. So our story continued. In April 1944, the Hungarian government issued a decree that all the Jews must move to the Budapest ghetto, or the so-called Yellow Star houses which were just like us, marked with the Yellow Star of David. In the left side of the screen, you can see where the Budapest ghetto was. It was part of the traditional Jewish quarter of Budapest, close to the great synagogue of Budapest, which is one of the oldest one and one of the most beautiful one. Now it's fully restored among the synagogues all over the world. And because the ghetto was very small relatively, and there were more than 220,000 Hungarian Jews still living in Budapest, there were so-called designated houses marked with the Yellow Star of David spread all over Budapest. You just see the inner part of the city. So we have to leave our apartment. We have to leave everything behind. My mother crammed as much as she could, her valuables, her documents in a small suitcase. I was on her arm when I was 3 years old, and I could walk just so little. So she had to pick me up also while we went to one of these Yellow Star houses. We were lucky enough that a far removed relative, my mother wasn't even in contact with them until 1944, but one of my uncles told her that this couple is already living in a protected house. They have a big apartment and they would gladly take us in. So we went there. We lived with this couple until things changed again. In October 1944, the war was winding down, and the Germans weren't happy with the Hungarian government. The Hungarian government already started negotiation with the Allied forces to get out from the German alliance and be part of the Western alliance. And the German Nazis removed the Hungarian government, and the far-right fascist party in Hungary, the so-called Arrow Cross Party, took over the government. And our life changed again. We had to move. All the Jews had to move. The Hungarian government announced over the radio, and posters were posted all over Budapest, that the still alive in Hungarian Jews in Budapest either should move to the Budapest ghetto or should report at a brickyard just outside Budapest. The brickyard was important for the deportation because it has a railway connection to the major railway lines, the raw material for the brick making, and the bricks which were made out of the raw materials were shipped by wagons and railway. So it was a very, very convenient place to gather all the Jews, put them in the cattle cars, and deport them to Auschwitz. My mother defied the Hungarian government. My mother was very courageous, very brave, very determined to survive. So she did everything she could, breaking the law, lying to authorities, just to save us. So she didn't report at the brickyard. And a couple of days later, somebody reported us that we were still in this yellow star house, and two Hungarian policemen, special police unit, gendarmerie, came to the apartment where we stayed, and they arrested my mom. This is one of the few personal memories because it was so shocking. I still remember I was, again, only 3 years old. These two gendarmeries came into the apartment. They had a very fancy uniform. We were sitting at the breakfast table, and they arrested my mother. I was crying. I was crying because, number one, I didn't even know what was happening. But I was crying because I was afraid of the gendarmerie myself, because my mom, not knowing that one day it would be detrimental to my well-being, when I didn't want to eat the food, she threatened me that if I don't eat my breakfast or lunch, then the police will come and will take me away. So I was afraid of them. I was afraid.
Peter, I'm
Yes.
sorry to interrupt for 1 second. Would you be able to finish up in 5 minutes just so we have time for questions and answers?
Yes, of course.
Okay, great. Thanks.
So we're gonna go a little bit faster. From the designated house, we moved to another house which was under the protection of the Swiss embassy. What happened in 1944 that the neutral countries, Spain, Portugal, Sweden, rented out houses for the purpose to save Jews. What they did was to put the sign of the embassy on this building, and under international laws, these houses were protected from the local police. Hungarian Jews who were in these houses, they couldn't be arrested. They also issued documents for tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews, which proved that they were either citizens or under the protection of the specific embassy. The house we went to, which is, I think, on the next slide, was protected by the Swiss embassy and specifically called Lutz. And we were safe for a little while, only a little while, because when the Hungarian Nazis, the Arrow Cross, took over the government, they couldn't care about international laws anymore. They came into these houses and they arrested the people who were there. With another lucky incident, we escaped the arrest, and we moved from the protected house, the internationally protected house, to the Budapest ghetto. It was in end of November, early December 1944. We lived there. We lived in the Budapest ghetto for, again, no more than 4 or 5 weeks. Living in the ghetto was horrible. Budapest was completely bombed out by this time, and we spent most of our times in the temporary air raid shelter, which was the basement of the house. No food, no water, no electricity, but we were alive. We were alive on January 17 when the Soviet Red Army liberated the Budapest ghetto, and we were free. We were free to go back to our apartment, which was occupied by an ethnic German couple. They weren't happy to see us to come back. Nevertheless, they let us in. We lived for the rest of my life in Hungary in the very same apartment where my parents were married and I was born. The picture you see here is taken from a passport in 1946 when we wanted to immigrate to the United States, where an uncle and an aunt of mine lived. They escaped the Holocaust because they left Hungary before it started. We couldn't get out from Hungary until 1949 when the Communist Party took over the government. They closed the borders and we were stuck there. I grew up in the communist system. That's a whole other story we don't have time for. In 1980, I defected to the United States. I started a new life. I worked, I am an electrical engineer by training. I did computer stuff in whole of my life and worked for NASA on great projects. And 2014, I retired. Finally, I had time for volunteering at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and I am here today to tell my story.
Thank you so much. Dana, you're up.
I cannot hear her.
Me neither. Okay, we're gonna do, Peter's open for questions now. So hopefully, Dana, we can get your sound going and you can do it, but you can start putting questions in the chat.
We still cannot hear you.
Yeah. Okay. So meanwhile, I'm going to ask a question while Dana figures out her sound here. So there's a question in the chat is, have you ever been able to reach out to research other members of the forced labor battalion?
Sorry, I didn't understand completely about the labor battalion.
They just wanted, someone asked if you have been able to reach out to like research or meet any of the people that were in that labor battalion with your father.
No, and unfortunately, that's a very sad story. I grew up in communist Hungary knowing hardly anything about the Holocaust. I knew there was a war. I knew that my father died in the war, but I didn't know the specifics because the Hungarian communist government just didn't want the people know what happened to more than 1/3 of the Hungarian Jewish population. So unfortunately also the survivors, including my mom, including my stepfather, who survived Auschwitz actually, never told their story. Actually, my mom opened up when I was in my 50s. I was already in the United States. That's why I learned about the postcards. That's when I learned about the diary. That's when I made a taped interview with her, and that interview and our personal conversations are the real sources of my presentation. So concerning survivors from the labor battalions, no, I did not, but I read memoirs and I read their stories. Actually, I have a book here, I believe, in my bookshelf. If you can see it, probably it's the mirror image if you can read it. Anyway, it's called Conscripted Slaves. That's where those people in the labor battalion were. And so I know their stories, but I don't know my father specifically.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I think we have some couple of questions from Ape Time. Do you want to ask the questions? Does a student want to ask the question, Laura? No, Dana's having.
Sure.
Great.
Does somebody want to ask a question? Just step up to the camera and ask one of the questions. No? Okay. That was a no, but our questions are, what happened to your mother, Mr. Gorog? I think you mentioned after she's arrested, but maybe remind us. And then after you defected, that's the first question.
No,
Yeah,
I'm supposed to be moderating. That's the problem.
I didn't.
Wait, Dana, we hear your sound.
I didn't have a chance to tell my mother's story. My mother was arrested. She was in an infamous Hungarian jail, the very same jail where probably many of you heard about Hannah Senes, the famous Israeli poet who happened to be Hungarian, who was captured by the Germans when she parachuted in Hungary to establish a connection with the partisans. Anyway, my mom was in the jail for 3 weeks. Nobody told her anything until finally she was led to the commandant of the jail. My mom had this document I told you earlier, the Red Cross notification as well as the death certificate. My mom claimed that she was a war widow, which she wasn't, because Jewish wives of deceased soldiers or people in the forced labor battalion did not qualify for all the benefits of so-called war widows. Nevertheless, this commandant had probably pity on my mom, and he let her go. He came back to the Yellow Star house where we were staying, and that's when we moved to the internationally protected safe house under Swiss protection.
Thank you. Dana, do you have sound? Are you able to facilitate now? Just checking. And I just want to comment, I do not know the Robin Rosenthal that posted in this chat. I removed her from the meeting. Do not send her money. We don't know anything about her. I don't know what that is.
So the issue I'm having is either we can hear, either I can hook you guys up to the speaker or I can use the microphone. So my group can't hear us.
I can hear you well.
My group can't hear us right now, but you guys can.
Well, that's not good. So I can just do the questions if that's easier.
That's already up on our.
It is, yeah.
So our group
Sorry,
would like
guys,
to know
I'm muted.
what happened to your mother after the war, after you defected.
Well, what happened to my mom, obviously she couldn't continue her business. Hats weren't fashionable anymore. And actually they were, people just couldn't afford them. And also the Hungarian confiscated, the communist government confiscated all the private businesses. And so she became a seamstress. She worked for a co-op. She worked hard, very hard. While I was growing up, she worked in 2 shifts, 6 to 2 and 2 to 10. So I didn't see her much. but she worked hard to put food on our table and keep our apartment
No, no, he
as
has the address.
possible. And that's what she did until she retired. That time, the retirement age for women was 55. She retired, and she lived in Hungary in all of her life. When I defected, we wanted her to move in with us, but she was an independent spirit. That's what helped us through the Holocaust, and that's helped her to live to the ripe age of 90. We visited her many times. She came to visit us. She met most of my grandchildren, unfortunately, children, but not my grandchildren. And she died at age 90.
Thank you. Did the other, sorry, it's a little complicated here. Do any of the other students have questions? They want to share? Anyone else in the community have questions?
Sarah, another one of our students wanted to know if it was difficult for Mr. Gorog to move between all the places he lived in the war.
Again, I was very young. I was protected. So I do remember our last move, the move from the Budapest ghetto back to our apartment. As I said, and there was a slide there, how badly Budapest was damaged during the war. Fortunately, our apartment wasn't. But I remember that the trip from the ghetto to our house, normally for a grown-up, takes about 15 minutes, the most 20. Obviously, I was 4 years old. It was a very cold winter. The snow wasn't removed from the street. Neither were the dead people who were lying in the snow, dead horses lying in the snow. I don't remember the stench, but I do remember that I always, or probably I threw up because it was just horrendous. And that's the only move I remember explicitly. All the others, I remember the places where we were. I remember some of the things I did, like playing in the inner court of the internationally protected house with my friends, little friends, playing cowboys and Indians and using sticks and broomsticks to imitate rifles and revolvers. And I remember that the Nazi Arrow Cross guards, who were not really guarding our building, they made sure that we would not escape. They were laughing at us because there we were little Jewish boys with the yellow star of David on our chest and imitating to shooting and killing each other.
Thank you. I think we have a question from the students at Shar Shalom. Do you want to ask the question yourselves, guys?
Somebody's muted.
Yeah, is someone trying to talk and muted? Okay, I don't hear them. So how did your mom get food to you and her and to eat in the ghetto and afterwards?
Well, I said that first the food was rationed. Later on, practically it wasn't available. What we ate was what our parents, or in my case, my mom and my grandma could find. What happened was that during the bombing of Budapest, while we were staying in the bomb shelters, between two bombing raids, the adults were able to leave the house we stayed, and they went to the bombed out buildings, rummaging through whatever was left and finding whatever food they could find. And they came back with stale bread or a can of something, and that's what we ate. We, again, that's a personal memory of mine because it was so unusual that one day my grandma came back from this rummaging trip with a big slab of bacon. Now, I don't have to tell you that we didn't eat bacon, especially in my mom's family, because we were very observant. But we ate the bacon. We ate the bacon because every calorie we took might have meant that we lived one day longer. And later on, I actually learned, very later on, because that's another story, my journey away from and back to Judaism. But later I learned that we really didn't break the Jewish dietary law, because there is a law in the Talmud which overrides it, namely you can break this law if it saves life, and it definitely saved our life.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing. That actually leads into one of the other questions was, what was your experience like reconnecting to your Jewish roots once you came to the United States? And wait, there's more.
Well, I don't know how much time I have, but I try to be as short as possible. I grew up in a secular country, which was not only secular, but actually anti-religious. And being trained to be an engineer, for me, it was easy to explain the whole universe on a natural basis. And I really didn't need a God, so to say. And unfortunately, because what happened to my mom during the Holocaust, she turned away from Judaism also. Not completely, but I never got a Jewish education. We hardly ever lit the Shabbat candles anymore. I started actually Jewish day school in 1947 until 1949. The Hungarian communist government took over the parochial schools, and that was the end of my Jewish education. So anyway, I grew up as a secular Jew. Interestingly enough, most of my friends were Jewish, but we didn't talk about being Jewish because it wasn't fashionable and it wasn't really important to us at that time. Coming to the United States, I had a dilemma, a big one, because I had to figure out who I was. I wasn't a Hungarian anymore. My Hungarian passport expired, and I really weren't very proud of to be Hungarian. I wasn't American because I hardly spoke the language and knew very little about the culture, and became a citizen only 1989. Anyway, so I was in an identity crisis, not like people today, but I had to choose an identity, and I chose my Jewish identity and reclaimed it. I started to go to shul, and again, that's a long story, at that time I lived in Baltimore with my uncle, and anyway, I didn't get that spiritual excitement I expected when I returned to Judaism. First, I went to an Orthodox synagogue with my uncle, who was a member there, and everything was in Hebrew, and the prayer book was in Hebrew only, and I didn't understand the word. So it was very hard to relate to Judaism. But one by one, slowly, I learned Hebrew, and I found a congregation where I felt very comfortable and loved. And here I am, and loving my Judaism, my heritage. And I am really glad that God gave me an opportunity to be there is a Jewish word, the second part, Baal Teshuvah, I believe, for those Jews who return to their Judaism.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. I know that our time is up and some of the students need to go. So I think we'll close it out now, but I'm offering that I know we didn't get to all the questions in the chat. If people are able to stay on after we close it out, Peter, if that's okay with you, you'll stay for a few minutes and we can answer questions for the ones I didn't, a little bit more informally for those who didn't. I do want to just answer quickly the one in the chat about educating. I want to say that Peter mostly speaks for the Holocaust Museum in public schools. And JCRC also does has survivors speak in public schools. It's just this week of Yom HaShoah, most of our presentations are for the Jewish community. But in general, I would say your work is with public schools. Is that correct, Peter?
Yes, I go to public schools, colleges. Actually, I go to Christian schools also. I went to Episcopalian school and Catholic school also.
Wonderful, wonderful. Listen, first of all, thank you so much for speaking. I'm sorry Dana had technical issues and we had to switch it around a little, but I got the honor of asking questions, so I'm delighted. Do you have a last message you want to send off with people before we say goodbye to some of the people that need to get going? Can't remember what we decided before.
Yeah, I would like to have a few words because it's very important to me personally and the work I do for the Holocaust Museum to remind people our motto that never again, and it has a second part also, what you do matters. And unfortunately, the never again is an aspiration as of today because we are not there. We had genocide after the Holocaust all over the world in Uganda and Cambodia and Bosnia, and there is a war going on right now in the very same land where my mother was born and where my father died. So we still have to work on the never again. But the second part of the motto, what you do matters, is very important because you saw that picture earlier where there were those bystanders who were laughing and they were indifferent to the suffering of their fellow citizens. And unfortunately, hatred and bullying and discrimination is alive and well, not to mention anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. So what we do, we all do, I do, and you, Sarah, and all the teachers and the students, it's extremely important. It does matter, and we cannot be bystanders anymore.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for coming. Feel free to stay on and unmute yourself and ask questions if you want at this point. We'll see if we have questions. I think a lot of the Hebrew schools end at 11:30. So that's why
I see somebody unmuted herself.
Oh, Lily, did you have a question?
Yeah, my husband had a question. Actually, his parents were from Hungary. His question was, Peter, can you recommend any books about Hungarian Jews related to the Holocaust, World War II, and early 20th century?
Can I recommend?
Yes, that was the question.
That was the question.
Yes.
Not any particular book. I'm sorry, you have to Google it. I'm sure there are plenty, and just nothing particular comes to my mind. I have a couple of books, but they were private editions. I don't think they are available on the internet. And but if you give your email to Sarah, and I can send Sarah, and she can forward it.
Okay, I'll put it in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry that I wasn't able, but I like your last name. Famous composer was named Smetana.
Okay. I'm
Smetana,
also
yeah,
having
okay.
technical difficulties with my computer. So Sarit, I'm making you the host in case I get disconnected. Sorry, Lily, did you have another question or comment?
No, I'm listening to Peter. I am a child of survivors and from Poland. And unfortunately, my father lost everybody. My mother just survived with her sister, being that they escaped to Russia. So they were the only survivors. So I never knew my grandparents. I don't have any pictures. I don't know actually which. I think some of them were taken to Majdanek or Treblinka, but we have no. My parents did not speak about it after the war. And I don't think after they returned to Poland from Russia, there was anything that they could find to tell them what happened to their parents and their siblings, which is a very sad story in itself. But anyway, thank you for the presentation. It was very moving.
Thank you for your kind words. Concerning researching family stories or relatives, the museum has a department, research or facing service, where you can submit names and anything you know about the person, and we can try to locate them. And if there is any record in any libraries or archives in Europe, they able to trace them down.
Right. So the Evil Institute?
Yeah.
No, that's the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and one of the department is I don't know exactly the name, but
Peter,
I can give you that information also by email.
Okay. Yeah.
Peter,
Okay. I guess
I think there's another question from Roberta.
And have somebody assist me to back to the city and, give me some pointers on how to go about it. But thank you for the information. I appreciate it.
Roberta?
Yes, thank you. Peter, thank you for your talk. It was really very moving and very important to hear. My question is, after the war, how did your fellow Hungarians treat you, the Jews in general?
Jews in general, obviously overt anti-Semitism was over with all the perpetrators, the major perpetrators, they were tried and most of them executed. I did not experience any overt anti-Semitism while I was growing up personally. However, I know one incident which happened. We were in elementary school when we were walking home from the school, a group of people who lived in the same neighborhood. There were and there are no school buses in Hungary. And two guys got into some kind of argument. I don't know what they were arguing about, probably about soccer teams, because that was very important topic for 12-year-old boys. And they got this big argument and they started to fight. And one of the guys were losing this fight. He was already on the ground. And he spit out, "I hate you, you dirty Jew." And again, I knew that I was Jewish and I wasn't very brave, but somehow this one hit me so hard that I started to pummel that guy also. And I went home with a bloody nose, and my mom asked me what happened. And she just told me, don't do this again. But again, there were latent anti-Semitism. And with hindsight, I realized there were cliques in my school, especially elementary school. And I wasn't part of certain cliques because they were most of children of people who were in the government or the army before the war. And they just had their own little circle. What they did, I don't know, but they were definitely separated from the rest of us. So that's all I know. There was, again, religion wasn't banned during the communist system. Actually, there was one Jewish high school. Actually, there was the only rabbinic seminary in Eastern Europe in Budapest. And we weren't explicitly banned from going to services. Actually, my aunt, who did not lose her faith and she followed her Orthodox practices, she went to shul every Saturday. People were afraid and kind of self-censored themselves because they knew if they the government who spied on us, and they knew who were the ones who went to shul. So those were mostly old people who didn't have anything to lose, but we who were government employees, because there were only government jobs in communist system, we cannot afford to be caught in a Jewish community center or a shul. So that was that's all I can tell about my treatment during the communist system. Changing my name from Grünwald to Gorog was actually my mom's fear that one day anti-Semitism will come to the surface, as it did after the communist system collapsed. And she was afraid that I can be singled out just because I had a Jewish-sounding name.
Once again, thank you, Peter. Thank you for answering the questions. Thank you for sharing your family's story.